Elisa stood in the cold stone courtyard, her heart heavy with dread. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face, carrying the faint scent of rain, but she barely noticed. The guards of the castle were coldly indifferent as they led her through the gates, their faces hidden beneath hoods. She had been sold. The thought lingered in her mind like a constant gnawing ache, the weight of it sinking into her chest. Her parents, the people who should have loved her unconditionally, had sold her for a few gold coins, all because she couldn't bear children. She was barren, a woman whose womb could never carry life, a failure in the eyes of the world. She had tried to hide it, to deny the emptiness inside her, but in the end it had led her to this, being sold like cattle to a stranger, a man who would see her only as a tool, nothing more. As they walked deeper into the castle's inner courtyard, Elisa could hear the sound of men shouting orders, the clang of metal against metal and the distant howl of wolves. Her pulse quickened. She had heard the stories of the Alpha King, the ruler of the land, a man feared by all. His pack of wolves was legendary, and the rumors of his cruelty had spread far and wide. But none of it had prepared her for the sight of the castle's towering walls, the dark, looming stone that seemed to swallow the light. It was a fortress of power, a place where she had no place, no voice. The guards led her through a set of massive wooden doors into the heart of the castle. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with the scent of burning wood and wild earth. The walls were adorned with tapestries of wolves in battle, and the flickering light of the torches cast long shadows across the stone floors. Elisa shivered, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming sense of being out of place. "Wait here," one of the guards ordered, his voice rough as he pushed her into a small, dimly lit room. She obeyed, her eyes tracing the edges of the stone walls, the only decoration being a few rusted weapons on the shelves. There was a small bed in the corner, a simple thing, but it looked like it could be her prison. Elisa's breath caught in her throat as she sank to the floor, her knees weak beneath her. She felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She was nothing now. A discarded object, nothing more than a woman who couldn't bear children, unwanted by her own family. Footsteps echoed outside the room and the door creaked open. A man entered, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding the space. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, and his golden eyes gleamed with a ferocity that made Elisa's heart race. This was him, the Alpha King. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and smooth, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down her spine. Elisa stood slowly, her knees trembling, and followed him as he led her down a long corridor. His presence was overwhelming, and she couldn't help but feel small beside him. He wasn't just any man. He was a king, a leader of wolves, a being who held power over life and death. She had heard the whispers of his cruelty, of how he treated those beneath him, and fear bubbled in her chest. They reached a large ornate door and he pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with the sound of children's laughter. Elisa blinked in confusion, her mind struggling to reconcile the noise with the man standing beside her. The Alpha King's children. She hadn't expected that. "Meet Arden and Lyra," he said, his tone softer than before. His gaze softened as he looked at the children, and for a moment Elisa could see something else in his eyes, something human, something vulnerable. The two children, a boy and a girl, looked up at her with curiosity. The boy, Arden, had striking green eyes that gleamed with mischief, while the girl, Lyra, seemed older than her years, her gaze full of wisdom that didn't belong in a child. Elisa's heart ached as she looked at them. She hadn't known what she had expected, but it certainly hadn't been this. Two children, vulnerable and in need of care. The Alpha King stepped forward, his gaze flicking to Elisa. "You will care for them," he said simply. Elisa swallowed hard, her mind racing. Care for them? How could she, a woman who couldn't even care for herself? But something in her heart stirred, a tiny spark of warmth as she looked at the children. They needed her, and in that moment she realized she needed them too. "Do you understand?" the Alpha King asked, his golden eyes locked on hers, his presence as overwhelming as ever. She nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." The Alpha King turned on his heel, his voice low as he spoke again. "Good. Your place here has been decided." Elisa was about to respond when he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "And remember, you are here for them, nothing more." The door shut behind him with a resounding thud, leaving Elisa alone with the two children. She stood there, her mind still reeling from the events that had led her here. She had been sold, discarded, and now she was here in the midst of a strange kingdom, with a new role she didn't fully understand. She had no choice but to embrace it, and as she looked at the two children in front of her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of something different. The children's laughter lingered in the air, a strange contrast to the tension that coiled around Elisa's chest. The door closed behind the Alpha King with a finality that left her alone, with the two unfamiliar faces staring up at her. The boy, Arden, couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, his wild hair and bright green eyes full of curiosity. Lyra, the girl, appeared older, perhaps 10, but her gaze was sharp, too sharp for a child. There was something in the way she looked at Elisa that made her feel like she was being assessed, judged. Elisa stood there, frozen in place. The Alpha King had left her with them, these two children who were now her responsibility. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this. How could she be? She had no experience with children, no idea what they needed or how to care for them. She had barely cared for herself in recent years, let alone another human life. Arden took a few tentative steps forward, his eyes never leaving her. "Are you our new mother?" His voice was soft, but there was a hint of hope in it. The word pierced Elisa's heart. She could hear the innocence in his voice, the trust that came with being a child, and it tore at her. She wasn't his mother, not really. She could never be his mother. She wasn't even sure she could be a good caretaker, but she had no choice but to try. She knelt down in front of him, trying to meet his gaze without letting her own fear show. I will take care of you," she said softly. The words felt foreign on her tongue, but they were the truth. She had no other option. Lyra, the older girl, stepped forward as well, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Do you know what you're getting into?" Her voice was surprisingly mature, and her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, seemed to see straight through Elisa. "This isn't just about feeding us and putting us to bed. We are not like other children." Elisa swallowed, unsure of how to respond. What did Lyra mean? Was it a warning? She had heard rumors, of course, whispers in the village about the strange powers of the Alpha King's children. They were hybrids, born of both human and wolf blood. But those were just stories, weren't they? She had never believed them. Elisa began, but the words faltered on her lips. She wasn't sure how to explain that she didn't know what she was doing. "I don't know what you mean," she admitted finally, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never done this before." Arden reached out and took her hand, his small fingers warm against her skin. "We're not like regular kids," he repeated, his tone gentle but insistent. "But that's okay. You'll learn." Elisa stared at him, her heart heavy. She hadn't asked for this, any of this. She hadn't asked to be sold, to be brought here to this cold castle with its towering walls and its unsettling atmosphere. But now that she was here, there was no turning back. She had to protect these children, if not for them, then for herself. "I'll do my best," Elisa said, her voice steadying with a quiet resolve. "I will take care of you both." Lyra nodded, a flicker of something, maybe approval, flashing across her face. "That's all we need," she said. "But remember, we are different. We may seem like children, but we're not like others. Be careful." Elisa nodded, although she had no idea what Lyra meant by that. She had only heard stories about the Alpha King's pack, about their fierce loyalty, their strength, their almost mythical powers. The children, she assumed, must have inherited some of that. It was enough to make her nervous. How could she, a woman with no power of her own, protect them if anything went wrong? As she looked down at the two children, she realized that they too were trapped in this world of power and danger. They weren't normal children. They were the Alpha King's heirs, and the weight of that legacy was something Elisa couldn't fully comprehend yet. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door creaked open, and a servant entered, bowing low. "The Alpha King requests your presence, my lady," the servant said, his voice respectful but distant. Elisa straightened, her heart racing. She had barely begun to understand her place in this strange new world, and now she was being summoned by the Alpha King himself. What did he want with her? The servant's eyes flickered toward the children for a brief moment, and then back to Elisa. "He is waiting for you," he repeated. Elisa hesitated for a moment before nodding. She turned back to the children, her gaze lingering on them. Arden was already playing with a small wooden toy, his focus entirely on it, while Lyra stood silently, her sharp eyes watching Elisa. "I'll be back soon," Elisa said, trying to offer them a reassuring smile, though she wasn't sure if they needed it or if she did. Lyra's eyes softened for a brief second, but then the mask of maturity returned. "Don't forget what I said," she warned quietly. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Elisa nodded, then followed the servant out of the room, her mind swirling with uncertainty. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. Her life had already changed forever, and nothing would ever be the same again. As she walked down the cold corridors toward the Alpha King's chambers, Elisa couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he really was, and what kind of future awaited her in his world. Elisa followed the servant down the cold stone corridors, each step echoing in the silence of the castle. The walls, thick with the weight of history, seemed to close in on her as she moved deeper into the heart of the fortress. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and old wood, and the flickering torchlight cast long, distorted shadows that made her feel as though she were being watched from every angle. Her mind raced, the questions swirling in her thoughts, like an endless storm. What had the Alpha King wanted with her? Why had he brought her here to this strange, intimidating place? She had barely exchanged a few words with him, yet there was something about him, something that pulled at her in a way she couldn't quite explain. He was a king, a powerful and feared ruler, and yet he had spoken to her as if they were equals. There was an unsettling softness in his eyes when he spoke of his children, a vulnerability she hadn't expected to find in a man so hardened by power. The servant led her to a large wooden door at the end of the hall, its surface intricately carved with images of wolves in mid-hunt. Elisa's heart skipped a beat as she stood before it, unsure of what awaited her on the other side. The servant gave a respectful nod before stepping back, his presence fading into the shadows of the corridor. Elisa took a deep breath and knocked lightly on the door. The sound reverberated through the stone walls, and for a moment all she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart. She had never felt so small, so insignificant, as she did in this moment. The door opened before she could second-guess herself. The Alpha King stood on the other side, his golden eyes gleaming in the dim light of the room. His presence was overwhelming, filling the space with a quiet authority that made Elisa hesitate. He motioned for her to enter, his movements graceful but commanding. "Come in," he said, his voice smooth and deep, like a low rumble of thunder. "You have questions, I assume." Elisa stepped inside, her gaze immediately drawn to the large stone fireplace that dominated one side of the room. A fire crackled inside, casting warm light across the room and illuminating the dark, worn tapestries that hung from the walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning oak, a stark contrast to the coldness that had greeted her in the hall. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She had so many questions, but where should she begin? "Why me? Why did you bring me here? I'm nothing more than a woman who failed to do what was expected of me." The Alpha King's eyes softened ever so slightly, though his expression remained stoic. He crossed the room with purposeful strides and motioned for her to sit at a nearby table. Elisa hesitated, unsure if she should accept his invitation. But the fire's warmth called to her, and she took a seat across from him, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "You're wrong," the Alpha King said, his tone low, almost gentle. "You are not here because of your failure. You are here because I need you, and because they need you." Elisa frowned, confused. "Who? The children?" The Alpha King nodded, his golden eyes never leaving hers. "Yes. Arden and Lyra, they are not like other children, they are different. Born of both human and wolf blood, They carry a heavy burden, and they need someone who can understand them, someone who can care for them without fear of what they are. Elisa blinked, her breath catching in her throat. But how can I do that? I'm just a woman who was sold by her own parents. The Alpha King's voice cut through her words, and Elisa fell silent. He watched her closely, his gaze sharp and calculating. I know what they did to you, what they tried to make you feel. But you are not defined by them, Elisa. You are not defined by your past. She felt a wave of emotion rise within her, anger, shame, and something else she couldn't quite name. Her mind raced, memories of her parents' cold disregard, their dismissive words about her infertility, and the way they had treated her like an object to be discarded. But the Alpha King's words hit harder than she had anticipated. He wasn't like the others. He saw her as something more than the woman who couldn't bear children. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You're the king. You could have anyone take care of them. Why me? The Alpha King leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. Because I can see you, Elisa. I see the strength in you, the same strength that made you survive. You were discarded by those who should have cared for you, but you didn't break. And that's exactly what they need, someone who won't break when things get hard. Elisa swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. She had never been seen like this before, never been understood. The past few days had felt like an endless blur of uncertainty, but in this room with the Alpha King's words hanging between them, she felt something stir inside her, something long buried. But I don't know what to do, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. I've never been a mother. I don't know how to care for them. The Alpha King smiled, but it was not a smile of mockery. You don't need to be a mother, Elisa. You just need to care, that's all they ask. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the room. Elisa sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had no choice now. She had to take on this role no matter how unprepared she felt. But as she met the Alpha King's gaze, she realized that perhaps she was more ready than she had thought. Not because of her past, not because of what she lacked, but because of what she had learned through her suffering. It had made her strong. It had made her capable. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. I'll try, she said quietly, her voice steady with newfound resolve. I'll try for them. The Alpha King nodded, his expression softening. I knew you would. And in that moment, Elisa felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was hers to walk, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had something to fight for. The days that followed were a blur of strange routines and quiet moments of introspection. Elisa had expected the castle to feel like a prison, and in some ways it did. But there was something else, something softer that began to take root in her heart. It was the children, Arden and Lyra. They were not what she had anticipated. At first, Elisa had approached her role with caution. She didn't know how to care for them, let alone protect them from whatever dangers lurked in the shadows of the kingdom. But as the days went on, she found herself slipping into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And the more she spent time with Arden and Lyra, the more she saw that they were not just children. They were survivors, just like her. Arden, despite his youth, had a mischievous spark that reminded Elisa of the wildness of the wolves she had heard about. His green eyes shone with a curiosity that sometimes bordered on mischief, and he would often drag Elisa into games, making her laugh despite herself. There was a certain innocence to him, a lightness that made Elisa feel like she could breathe again. Lyra, on the other hand, was a different story. She was quiet, but there was a depth in her eyes that Elisa could never quite decipher. The girl seemed older than her years, her mind always working, calculating, observing. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried weight. It was as though she had seen too much for someone so young, and Elisa often wondered what it was that weighed so heavily on her. One afternoon, after the sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, Elisa found herself sitting on the stone bench in the garden, watching Arden chase after a butterfly. Lyra sat beside her, her gaze distant as she traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. The evening air was cool, but it carried a sweetness to it, a fleeting reminder of the outside world beyond the castle walls. "I don't understand them," Elisa said softly, her words more for herself than for Lyra. She watched as Arden's laughter echoed through the garden. "They're so different, not just because of what they are, but because of how they see the world." Lyra's gaze shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she considered Elisa's words. "They are like the wolves," Lyra said, her voice low, almost too quiet to hear. "They are part of the pack, and the pack sees things differently than humans do." Elisa turned to look at Lyra, her brow furrowing in confusion. "But they're children. How can they understand so much about the world already?" Lyra's eyes darkened for a brief moment, and then she shrugged, a nonchalant gesture that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't have to understand. You just have to accept that they are who they are. The pack is their family. We don't always choose our family, but we protect them. We fight for them." Elisa absorbed Lyra's words in silence, feeling a strange weight in the air between them. There was something primal in the way Lyra spoke, something ancient. The pack, she had said, the pack was everything. "I will protect them," Elisa said quietly, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty in her chest. She wasn't sure where this newfound determination came from, but it was there, solid and unshakable. Lyra turned to her, her gaze sharp. "I know you will. But protecting them means more than just keeping them safe from harm. It means understanding what they are, and what they need." Elisa met Lyra's eyes, something passing between them in that quiet moment. The girl had seen something in her, something that made her believe Elisa could do more than just care for the children. Lyra saw her as part of the pack, as someone worthy of this responsibility. Arden suddenly ran up to them, his small face flushed with excitement. "Look, look!" He held up a tiny, fragile butterfly in his hands. "I caught it!" Elisa smiled, a warmth blooming in her chest as she looked at the boy's beaming face. The innocence in his eyes was a stark contrast to the world around them. "You're very fast," Elisa said, reaching out to gently touch the butterfly's wings. "But be careful. It's delicate." Arden nodded eagerly, his excitement barely contained. "I'll let it go soon. I just wanted to show you." As the butterfly fluttered away into the growing dusk, Elisa couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. The bond she had with the children was still new, still fragile, but it was growing. She wasn't just their caretaker. She was becoming part of their world, their strange, complex world, where nothing was simple and everything had its place. Lyra, who had been silently observing the interaction, finally spoke again. "The Alpha King is right. You are different from them." Elisa blinked, unsure of what Lyra meant by that, but before she could ask, Arden tugged at her sleeve. "Come play with me, Elisa." "I want to race you to the big tree." Elisa smiled, her heart lightening at the child's enthusiasm. She had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, that she would be here in this place, caring for children who were part wolf, part human. But now that she was here, she realized that this was where she belonged. The pack had found her, just as she had found them. She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt, and nodded to Arden. "All right, race you to the tree." And for the first time in a long while, Elisa felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The day after the race in the garden, Elisa found herself standing before the massive doors of the Alpha King's study. She had been summoned once again, and her heart fluttered with the same nervous energy she had felt when she first arrived at the castle. It was strange. She had thought that after a few days things might begin to feel more familiar, more comfortable. But they hadn't. The weight of the castle's silence, the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly along the walls, made it impossible to fully relax. The servant, who had become a near constant presence in her life, stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "The Alpha King is waiting," he said, his voice firm yet distant, as though he were used to this routine. Elisa nodded, her throat tight. She had no idea what the Alpha King wanted from her this time, but a small part of her dreaded the idea that it might be something she couldn't handle. She had promised to protect his children, to care for them, but what if that wasn't enough? What if the responsibilities he was placing on her were too much for her to bear? As the servant opened the doors, the warm glow of firelight spilled out from the study. The Alpha King was seated at a large wooden desk, his back to her as he gazed out of the window. The room smelled of parchment and ink, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. It was a moment of peace, but there was an underlying tension in the air, an unspoken expectation. "You wanted to see me?" Elisa asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt inside. She stood at the threshold, hesitant to enter further. The Alpha King didn't immediately respond. He remained silent for a long moment, his golden eyes distant as though he were weighing something heavy in his mind. Finally he spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "I need you to understand something, Elisa," he began, his gaze shifting toward her. "The children, Arden and Lyra, they are not just my responsibility, they are my legacy." Elisa blinked in confusion, unsure where he was going with this. I don't understand," she admitted, her brow furrowing. He stood then, moving around the desk with a fluid grace that reminded her of the wolves she had heard so much about. There was an undeniable power in the way he moved, in the way he commanded the space around him. "Their mother is gone," the Alpha King continued, his voice quieter now, tinged with something Elisa couldn't quite place. "I failed them, Elisa. I couldn't protect her, couldn't save her from the dangers that come with being in this world." Elisa's heart tightened. She had heard that the Alpha King had lost his wife, but hearing him speak of it so openly, with such vulnerability, was something she hadn't expected. "I was left to raise them alone," he said, his golden eyes meeting hers, "and it has been harder than I care to admit. I need someone to help me, someone who can give them the care and love they deserve, someone who can be there for them when I cannot." Elisa swallowed, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. "But I'm not their mother," she said, almost to herself. "I can't be what their mother was." The Alpha King stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I never asked you to be their mother. What I ask is that you care for them, that you give them the safety and love they've never known. You're already more than you think, Elisa." Elisa's chest tightened as she listened to him. She could hear the pain in his voice, the unspoken burden of being a leader, a father and a man who had lost so much. The weight of responsibility rested heavily on his shoulders, and Elisa could see that now, perhaps more than ever before. "I'll do what I can," Elisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll care for them, but I don't know if I can ever be what they need." The Alpha King was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't speak immediately, but there was a certain understanding in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that she was trying, that she was doing more than anyone else ever had for his children. "They need you, Elisa," he said finally. "Not because you're their mother, but because you see them. You understand them. That's what matters." Elisa felt a pang of something, regret, hope, maybe even fear, as the words settled in her heart. She didn't know if she was truly capable of what he was asking of her. She didn't know if she could truly protect the children or care for them in the way they needed. But there was something in his gaze, in the quiet strength of his presence, that made her want to try. The Alpha King turned away from her then, his expression unreadable as he gazed back out the window. "I didn't want to do this alone," he said quietly, "and I don't want to lose them too." Elisa stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite process. The Alpha King's words echoed in her mind. "You see them, you understand them." It was a strange thing to hear, something she had never expected from someone like him. The walls he had built around himself seemed so impenetrable, but in this moment, Elisa felt like she had glimpsed something more. A man, not just a king. She nodded slowly, unsure of what the future would bring. "I'll stay. I'll do what I can." The Alpha King didn't turn back to face her. Instead, he nodded once sharply. "Good. That's all I can ask." Elisa left the study, the door closing softly behind her. As she walked down the hall, She felt the weight of the Alpha King's intentions pressing down on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the responsibility he had placed on her, but there was no turning back now. The future of the children, of the pack, and perhaps even her own future, was now tied to this castle, and to the Alpha King's silent plea for help. The next morning, Elisa found herself standing before the training grounds of the castle. The air was thick with tension, the sound of clashing metal echoing across the courtyard. Men in armor sparred, their swords ringing against shields in rhythmic succession. The sky overhead was heavy with the promise of rain, and a low mist clung to the earth beneath her feet. Elisa stood there, unsure of what she was supposed to do. The children, Arden and Lyra, had been taken to their lessons for the day, and the Alpha King had given her a new task. She was to join the warriors in their morning exercises, to learn how to defend herself, and the children should danger come knocking at the castle gates. It seemed almost absurd. Elisa had never picked up a weapon in her life. She had been raised to believe that a woman's worth was tied to her ability to nurture, to be gentle, to care for others. But in this world, those qualities didn't seem to matter. Here, survival meant strength, and strength came from the blade. A servant approached her, a sword in his hand. He handed it to her without a word, his expression neutral, before stepping back to watch her. Elisa gripped the hilt, her palms sweaty against the cold metal. The sword was heavier than she had expected, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. It felt foreign, like she was holding something meant for someone else. "Do not overthink it," a voice called from behind her, low and commanding. Elisa turned to find one of the warriors, Talon, if she remembered correctly, standing with his arms crossed over his chest. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel small. Elisa began, her voice faltering. "I've never held a sword before." Talon didn't seem surprised. "You will learn quickly, then." He stepped forward, his posture fluid and poised. "Hold it with both hands. Your stance should be steady, balanced. Keep your feet shoulder-width apart." Elisa did as he instructed, her legs wobbling slightly as she tried to find her footing. She felt awkward, clumsy. The sword felt heavy, uncomfortable in her grip, and she wondered how anyone could wield such a weapon with any semblance of grace. Talon moved behind her, his presence imposing as he adjusted her stance, his hands briefly guiding hers. "You are not here to fight like a man, Elisa," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "You are here to fight like a woman who has something worth protecting. That's the only lesson that matters." The words struck her like a lightning bolt, sharp and powerful. She had something worth protecting now, Arden, Lyra, and the pack. It wasn't just about defending herself anymore. It was about them. "Now move the sword," Talon instructed, stepping back to give her room. "It's not about force, but control. You must control the blade, or it will control you." Elisa nodded, her heart racing as she took a deep breath. The weight of the sword seemed to lessen as she began to move it, her arms slowly adjusting to the rhythm Talon had shown her. It felt awkward, yes, but she could feel a flicker of something inside her, something primal. It was as if the sword itself had awakened a part of her she hadn't known existed. Her movements were slow at first, hesitant, but she kept going, each swing more fluid than the last. Talon watched her closely, his expression unreadable. She didn't know if she was doing well or failing miserably, but she couldn't stop. The rhythm of the sword against the air was strangely calming, like a pulse, like life itself. "You're getting there," Talon said after a few minutes, his voice approving, though still stern. "But remember, a warrior does not hesitate. A warrior does not second-guess themselves." Elisa's breath came in short gasps, her arms beginning to ache from the exertion. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. She could hear the faint sounds of children's laughter in the distance, a reminder of why she was doing this. She was doing this for them, for Arden and Lyra, and for the future that was still so uncertain. She would protect them, no matter what it took. The sword felt less like an obstacle now, and more like an extension of her body, a tool that could be wielded with purpose. She wasn't just learning to fight, she was learning to survive. And she would need to be strong, not just for herself but for the children and the pack. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she turned to see the Alpha King standing at the edge of the courtyard, his dark figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He watched her with a look of quiet approval, his golden eyes gleaming as he observed her training. Talon, noticing the Alpha King's presence, nodded respectfully. "You've done well, Elisa," he said before turning away. "We'll continue tomorrow." Elisa lowered the sword, her chest heaving with exertion. She didn't know if she had done well or not, but one thing was clear: she had taken her first step. The road ahead was long, but it had begun. The Alpha King approached her, his gaze never leaving her face. "You are stronger than you think," he said, his voice low and steady. Elisa looked at him, her breath still unsteady. "I don't know if I am," she admitted. "You are," he replied simply. "And that will be enough." As he turned to leave, Elisa stood there holding the sword in her trembling hands, a quiet sense of determination settling in her chest. She had something worth fighting for now, and she would fight for it with everything she had. The days had passed quickly since Elisa's first training session, each one blurring into the next, as she continued to adjust to her new life at the castle. The routine was becoming familiar. Arden and Lyra, though still distant at times, had started to rely on her more, and the weight of the sword had slowly begun to feel less foreign in her hands. But despite her progress, a nagging feeling lingered in her mind. There was something about this world, about the Alpha King and his pack, that she couldn't fully comprehend. The more she learned about the pack's ways, the more she realized that she was only scratching the surface of what she needed to understand. It was late one evening when the tension that had been building for days finally came to a head. Elisa had just finished dinner in the grand hall and was on her way back to her quarters when she heard a sound, a low growl, faint but unmistakable. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing as her instincts screamed at her to be cautious. She turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the shadows near the garden entrance, was a figure, a large, dark shape with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light. Elisa's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her sword, the metal cold against her palm. The growl came again, louder this time, and Elisa's pulse quickened. It was a wolf. But it wasn't just any wolf. This creature was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its eyes gleamed with an almost supernatural intelligence, and its presence was suffocating. Elisa couldn't move, her body frozen between fear and curiosity. "Do not be afraid," a voice said behind her, low and calm, yet carrying a weight that made Elisa's heart skip a beat. She turned quickly to see the Alpha King standing in the doorway, his golden eyes glowing in the moonlight. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that gave Elisa pause, a mix of reassurance and something deeper, something darker. Is it dangerous?" Elisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Alpha King stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. "No, it is not dangerous, but it is something you must understand. This is not just a wolf, it is a part of the pack, just as I am." Elisa watched as the Alpha King approached the creature, his hand outstretched toward it. The wolf in turn stepped forward, its massive form tense but submissive, as it allowed him to touch its fur. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. There was something primal in the way they interacted, a bond that went beyond mere companionship. It was as if the wolf was an extension of the Alpha King himself, and in that moment, Elisa realized just how deeply the pack ran through his veins. The wolf lowered its head, almost as if in deference to the Alpha King's presence. Elisa took a cautious step forward, her hand still on her sword. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. This was no ordinary man. The Alpha King was a creature of two worlds, one human, one wolf, and the weight of that duality was evident in the way he stood there, in the way the wolf responded to him. "It's beautiful," Elisa murmured, her gaze fixed on the wolf's sleek, dark coat. The Alpha King glanced at her, his expression softening for a brief moment. "It is, but it is also a reminder of the power we hold. The pack is not just a family, it is a force, and as part of this pack, you will need to understand that power. You will need to learn how to tap into it to call upon it when the time comes. Elisa felt a shiver run down her spine as his words sunk in. She had seen the strength in the Alpha King, in the way he led his pack, but this was something else entirely. The wolves, the pack, they were not just a symbol of strength. They were living, breathing forces of nature. And Elisa was now part of that world. The wolf stepped back as the Alpha King lowered his hand, his golden eyes meeting Elisa's. This is only the beginning. You are not just caring for Arden and Lyra. You are becoming part of something much greater than you can imagine. Elisa's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the Alpha King, her mind racing with the implications of his words. What had she gotten herself into? Was she truly ready for what lay ahead? The Alpha King turned away from her, his gaze shifting back to the wolf. "Come," he said, his voice low. "There is more you must learn." Elisa hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by a sense of something deeper within her, she followed him. She was stepping into a world of power and danger, a world where survival wasn't just a matter of strength, but of understanding the very nature of the pack. As she walked beside the Alpha King and the wolf, Elisa couldn't help but wonder what this journey would truly mean for her. She had come to the castle as an outsider, but now she was starting to feel something else, something that felt like belonging. Whether she was ready or not, her path had been set, and there was no turning back now. The following days passed in a haze, each one blending into the next as Elisa's training continued. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled into the castle, unsure of her place or her purpose. There was something growing within her now, something that she couldn't ignore. Her training with the sword was more rigorous, her arms now growing stronger, though they still trembled with the weight of the weapon. Talon, the warrior who had become her instructor, was relentless. Every morning they sparred, and every night her muscles screamed in protest. But she did not stop. She couldn't stop. The weight of the Alpha King's expectations rested heavily on her shoulders. He had trusted her with his children, and though she had promised to protect them, she still felt the heavy uncertainty that clouded her every decision. The children, Arden and Lyra, had grown closer to her, yet Elisa felt an invisible wall between them, one she couldn't quite break down. She would look at them, and despite the affection they showed her, there was a sense of detachment, a silent acknowledgement that they were not like other children. She was not like other mothers. They had their own world, one of wolves and power that she could never fully understand. It wasn't just their heritage that separated them, but something deeper, something innate in the very blood that ran through their veins. One evening, as she sat alone by the fire in her quarters, her thoughts spiraled. The flames crackled in front of her, the orange glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. The firelight was a comforting warmth, but it could not ease the coldness she felt inside. There was a conflict within her, one that she couldn't reconcile. Was she truly capable of this? Was she capable of being the protector the Alpha King needed? She had been sold by her own family, discarded for being barren, and now she was expected to step into a role that felt as foreign as the sword she now wielded. She wasn't a warrior. She was a woman who had been forced to survive. But then a small voice inside her whispered, "You have always survived." Elisa clenched her fists, trying to hold on to that quiet resolve, but doubts continued to gnaw at her. She wasn't a mother, not truly. Her only connection to these children was a shared sense of loss, of abandonment. They were survivors just like her, but were they truly hers to protect? A knock on the door broke her reverie, and she stood quickly, her heartbeat quickening. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or anxious, but she didn't have time to figure it out. She had learned long ago that uncertainty was a constant in this world. "Come in," she called, trying to steady her breath. The door opened slowly and Lyra stepped inside, her presence like a shadow. The girl had been unusually quiet these past few days, and Elisa had noticed the subtle distance between them. Lyra's eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable. "Are you well?" Elisa asked, though she already knew the answer. There was something in the air, a tension that neither of them could ignore. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She moved toward the fire, her small figure framed by the flickering light, her silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. I know you've been training hard, Lyra said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But that isn't enough. Elisa's heart skipped a beat. She turned to face the girl, unsure of what she meant. What do you mean? Lyra's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Elisa saw something like sorrow in them. You aren't just training to fight, Elisa. You're training to become part of the pack. And that isn't something that can be learned with a sword or a shield. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. I don't understand. I'm doing what I can. I'm trying to protect you, to protect both of you. She gestured toward the door where Arden was likely playing outside with the other wolves. Lyra shook her head slowly. You don't understand because you've never been part of the pack. You've never been part of something that isn't just about survival, but about family, about blood. The Alpha King doesn't just need you to protect us. He needs you to accept us, all of us, to see us for what we truly are. The words hit Elisa like a slap, and she felt the weight of them settle deep in her chest. She had thought she could protect them, just as she had protected herself for so long. But it wasn't enough. Lyra was right. Elisa was an outsider, a woman who had been thrust into a world she had never asked for, and she didn't know if she would ever be able to truly belong. I don't know if I can, Elisa whispered, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. I don't know if I can ever be what you need. For a long moment, Lyra was silent. Then she walked toward Elisa, her steps deliberate. She looked up at Elisa with the kind of intensity that made her heart tighten. You already are, Lyra said softly. You just have to believe it. Elisa stood there, staring down at the girl, feeling the weight of her words settle over her like a blanket. You already are. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to be the protector they needed, but the doubt that clung to her was suffocating. As Lyra turned and walked back toward the door, Elisa was left alone once more, the quiet of the room pressing in on her. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to be what they needed, but one thing was clear. If she was ever going to find a place here, she would have to confront the woman inside her that still felt broken and incomplete, and somehow she would have to find a way to heal. For them. For herself. The morning air was sharp, a cold breeze sweeping across the courtyard as Elisa stood beside the training grounds. The walls of the castle loomed over her, casting long shadows that stretched into the early hours of the day. The sounds of distant voices of weapons clashing filled the air, and Elisa's heart quickened. Today was different. Today the Alpha King had summoned her for something more than just her regular training. Talon, her instructor, had appeared earlier in the day with a solemn expression, handing her a cloak and guiding her to the courtyard. Prepare yourself, Elisa, he had said simply. The Alpha King wishes to test your readiness. Now standing in the open expanse of the training ground, Elisa felt a tension in her chest. She had come to this castle uncertain, but over time she had started to believe in the path that had been set before her. The weight of the sword in her hand, the strength in her arms, it was all starting to feel like a part of her. But today, as the wind whipped around her, the doubt that had been hidden deep within her began to surface again. What if she wasn't ready? What if the Alpha King was wrong about her? She could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, and without turning around, she knew who it was. The Alpha King. His presence filled the space like an overwhelming force, and Elisa straightened instinctively. He was not just the ruler of this kingdom, but the leader of an ancient, powerful pack. He had placed his trust in her, and the weight of that trust felt heavier than the sword she carried. You've been training well. The Alpha King's voice broke the silence, smooth but carrying an edge of command. Elisa turned to face him, her heart racing as his golden eyes met hers. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, a depth that she could never quite place. Thank you, Elisa replied, her voice steady despite the nerves that stirred within her. I've been trying my best. The Alpha King nodded, his expression unreadable. Today, you will face a trial, a challenge to test your strength and resolve. You are not just learning to fight, you are learning to lead, to protect, and to belong to this pack. Elisa swallowed hard, the reality of what he was saying sinking in. A trial? She repeated. Not just any trial, the Alpha King replied. A trial that will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. But you must face it, Elisa. You must confront your own fears, your own doubts. Only then will you understand the true nature of the pack and of your place within it. The word struck her like a blow. She had thought that her training had been the real test, but this was something else entirely. What did he mean by confronting her own fears? The doubt she had buried deep inside her, the fear that she wasn't truly capable, that she was an outsider in a world that demanded more than she could give. Had he seen all of that in her? The Alpha King motioned for her to follow him as he walked toward the center of the training ground. This challenge will be unlike any you've faced before, he continued, his voice low and steady. You will face not just physical trials, but tests of your mind and your heart. You will face yourself, Elisa. Elisa's pulse quickened at his words. She had been prepared to fight, to defend, to protect, but to face herself. She had spent so long burying her past, pushing aside the feelings of inadequacy, that the idea of confronting them now felt impossible. Are you ready? The Alpha King asked, his voice piercing through her thoughts. Elisa hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She was no stranger to hardship. She had survived, time and time again. But the thought of facing the parts of herself she had tried so hard to ignore was terrifying. Yes, she said finally, her voice firm despite the doubt swirling inside her. I am ready. The Alpha King studied her for a moment, and for the first time, Elisa saw something shift in his expression. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of something that could almost be mistaken for approval. Good, he said quietly. This is the beginning of something more than you realize. With that, he stepped back, signaling the start of the trial. The ground beneath Elisa's feet felt solid, unyielding, but her heart raced as she took her first step into the challenge that awaited her. She could hear the murmurs of the warriors who had gathered around to watch, their eyes watching her with silent expectation. As Elisa stood there, ready to face whatever came next, she felt a sense of determination rise within her. The doubts that had plagued her for so long were still there, lingering like shadows at the edges of her mind. But for the first time, she felt something else too, a glimmer of confidence, however small. She was here now, and she would face this trial, not just for the Alpha King, not just for the children, but for herself. The sound of the Alpha King's voice echoed across the courtyard. Begin! And just like that, Elisa's trial had begun. Elisa's heart pounded as she stood at the center of the training grounds, the cold wind biting against her skin. Her grip on the sword was firm, but her hands trembled slightly from both the chill and the weight of the moment. The Alpha King had called this a trial, but as she looked around, she realized just how much more it was than that. This was her moment, not just to prove herself to him, but to herself. She stood alone, facing a series of obstacles that had been set up around the courtyard. The warriors were gathered in a silent circle, watching her every move. There was no turning back now. She had committed herself to this trial, and the eyes of the pack were upon her. A low rumble from the Alpha King broke the silence. This trial will test your resolve, Elisa, he said, his voice deep and commanding. It is not just a matter of strength, it is a matter of will. Elisa nodded, though her heart was racing. She understood now. The sword in her hand, the training she had endured, all of it had led to this moment. But this wasn't about skill alone. It was about confronting every doubt she had ever felt about herself, every hesitation that had held her back. Talon, who had become her sparring partner over the past weeks, stepped forward. His face was hard, impassive, as he stood in front of her, holding his own weapon. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. She had sparred with him many times, but never like this. This wasn't practice. This was real. Are you ready? Talon's voice was sharp, his stance unwavering. Elisa nodded once more, her pulse quickening. I'm ready. Without another word, Talon lunged forward, his sword coming down in a swift arc. Elisa barely had time to react. The metal clashed against her sword, sending a shockwave through her arms. She staggered back, but she didn't lose her footing. She was learning to anticipate, to feel the rhythm of the fight. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but now, in the heat of it, she had to rely on her instincts. Talon pressed the attack, each strike faster than the last. Elisa parried each one, but she could feel the weight of the fight beginning to wear on her. Her arms were aching from the effort, and her mind raced with the knowledge that one wrong move could end it all. She could hear the warriors around the ring murmuring, their voices a low hum in the background, but all Elisa could focus on was the force of Talon's strikes, the way his blade cut through the air with a precision she couldn't yet match. She felt out of place, like an imposter. She wasn't a warrior. She was a woman who had been thrust into a world of strength and survival. But something in her snapped, a flash of realization. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the children, for the pack, for the future that was uncertain, that was fragile. She had to survive. She had to be strong for them. With a sudden surge of determination, Elisa blocked Talon's next strike, pushing him back with an unexpected force. Her movements became sharper, more fluid. She wasn't just reacting anymore, she was leading the fight. She felt the power in her muscles, the control over her weapon. Talon's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or approval, but Elisa didn't pause to think about it. She lunged forward, her sword sweeping through the air with the precision and speed she had only dreamed of. Talon stepped back, momentarily caught off guard by her newfound confidence. She pressed the attack. Strike! Parry! Strike again! It was no longer about following the rhythm of the fight. It was about commanding it. Elisa's breath came in shallow gasps, but her movements were steady, her grip on the sword tightening with every swing. Finally, she caught him off balance. With a quick feint, she disarmed Talon, sending his sword clattering to the ground. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't lower her weapon. She kept her gaze locked on him, her chest heaving as she held her position. Talon raised his hands, signaling surrender, his lips curling into a rare, approving smile. "Well done," he said, his voice deeper than usual, tinged with respect. The crowd of warriors murmured their approval, their eyes wide with a mix of surprise and admiration. Elisa's legs wobbled slightly beneath her, but she held herself upright. She had done it. She had faced the trial and come out victorious, not just against Talon, but against every doubt she had ever carried. The Alpha King stepped forward, his golden eyes gleaming in the sunlight. His gaze swept over Elisa, then to Talon before meeting her eyes again. "You've proven yourself," he said, his voice steady and unyielding, "but this is just the beginning. You are more than capable of leading the pack." Elisa's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had done it. She had fought, and she had won, not just for herself, but for the future she was now a part of. The pack was her family now, and she would fight for them, no matter the cost. With a final nod from the Alpha King, Elisa lowered her sword, her breath still ragged but her spirit stronger than ever before. She had faced the trial, and she had survived. The days that followed Elisa's victory in the trial were both triumphant and somber. Her newfound strength, both physical and emotional, was a source of pride, but it also brought with it a weight of responsibility she had never fully grasped until now. She could feel the eyes of the pack on her, the expectations of the Alpha King and the warriors that surrounded her. She had passed the test, but the real challenge was just beginning. One evening, as she walked through the quiet corridors of the castle, Elisa found herself drawn to the garden. The moonlight bathed the flowers in a soft glow, casting long shadows against the stone walls. It was a peaceful night, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to relax, to simply breathe. But the stillness didn't last long. A figure emerged from the shadows, Rowan, the Alpha King. "Elisa," he said, his voice carrying through the night air, warm but laden with something deeper. His presence was always commanding, but tonight there was something different about him. His golden eyes were unreadable, though there was a softness in his gaze that made Elisa's heart flutter, despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Rowan," she replied, her voice steady but her emotions betraying her. She had come to care for him in a way she hadn't expected. But it was more than that. There was a bond between them, forged through the trials, the shared moments of vulnerability. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've done well. The trial, the children, everything. You've proven yourself stronger than I could have hoped." Elisa felt a rush of pride, but it was quickly tempered by a quiet unease. "Thank you, but it's not just about me. It's about the pack. It's about protecting them." Rowan nodded, taking a step forward until they were standing close, the space between them almost non-existent. "Yes, but it's also about you, Elisa. What you've given, what you've sacrificed, the strength you've shown, it's more than I could have asked for." Her heart thudded in her chest. The Alpha King's words held more weight than she expected, and they struck her in a way she couldn't fully explain. They weren't just words of praise, they were words of acknowledgement, of recognition. And in that moment, Elisa realized that she had given something to him as well. Not just her strength, but a piece of herself. "I'm just trying to do what's right," Elisa whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet night. "I'm not a warrior. I never was. But I'm here now. For them. For the pack." Rowan's eyes softened as he reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shiver through her body. There was a tension between them now, a quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken. She wasn't sure what it was. Love, maybe, or a deeper connection. But it was there, hanging in the air like the scent of the night flowers around them. "You've become more than you realize, Elisa," Rowan said softly. "You're not just part of the pack. You are the heart of it now." Her breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words settled in, and for a moment, Elisa felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. She wasn't just a caretaker. She wasn't just a woman trying to find her place in this strange new world. She was part of something much bigger, and the Alpha King, Rowan, saw her for that. "I don't know if I can be what you need," Elisa confessed, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can be enough for you, for the children, for this pack. I've never been enough. I was always the one discarded." Rowan stepped closer, his presence overwhelming as he gently cupped her face in his hands. His touch was warm, grounding. "You are enough, Elisa. You always have been. And I will never ask you to be anything you're not. What you are now, what you've become, that is enough." Elisa's heart raced, her emotions swirling in a mixture of doubt, longing, and something else, something deep and aching. She closed her eyes as his words washed over her, feeling the warmth of his touch against her skin. She had never been told she was enough, not by her parents, not by anyone. But here, in this moment with Rowan, she felt it. She felt seen. "I don't know if I can love you the way you deserve," Elisa whispered, her voice breaking. "But I will try. I will try for you, for the children, for this pack." Rowan's lips curled into a small, gentle smile, his eyes soft as they gazed into hers. "That's all I ask, Elisa. That's all anyone could ever ask." The night stretched on in silence between them, and though neither of them spoke, the weight of the moment lingered. Elisa knew that there were still obstacles ahead, challenges she could not yet see, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she was facing them alone. In that quiet moment, as Rowan's hand rested against hers, Elisa understood something deeper. This was no longer just about survival. This was about love and sacrifice and the bonds that held them together. And in that moment, she knew she would do whatever it took to protect the pack and the man who had become more than just a king to her. The quiet that had settled over the castle in the days following Elisa's trial was shattered one evening by a distant, unsettling sound. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. It howled through the trees surrounding the castle, shaking the branches like skeletal hands trying to reach inside. Elisa stood near the window of her chamber, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun had set hours ago, and the pale moonlight cast long shadows across the grounds. Something wasn't right. Her instincts, honed over years of survival, screamed at her that danger was near. She could feel it in the air, thick with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A sharp knock on her door broke the stillness. Elisa turned sharply, her heart already racing as she crossed the room to answer. She opened the door to find Talon standing in the corridor, his usual stoic expression replaced with one of urgency. "The Alpha King requires your presence," he said in a low, hurried voice. "There has been a breach." We are under attack. Elisa's blood ran cold. An attack? From who? She asked, her voice steady despite the rising panic within her. Talon's face hardened. A group of rogues. They've breached the eastern gate. The Alpha King is rallying the pack, but we need to prepare. Without another word, Elisa quickly gathered her cloak and followed Talon through the dimly lit halls of the castle. The walls, usually so comforting, now seemed oppressive, each step she took echoing in the silence. She could hear the sound of distant shouting, the clash of steel, and the rhythmic pounding of boots on stone. The castle was under siege, and she had no choice but to fight. They reached the courtyard, where the Alpha King stood, already dressed in battle armor. His posture was commanding, but there was a coldness in his gaze, a flicker of concern that Elisa had never seen before. "Get ready," Rowan said, his voice low but strong. He turned his eyes toward Elisa, his gaze softening for a brief moment. "I need you to stay close. You're part of the pack now, and your role has never been more important." Elisa's heart beat faster as she looked at him. He was a king, a leader of a pack that could tear through anything in its path. And yet in this moment, he wasn't just the Alpha King, he was a man who needed her, who trusted her to stand by his side. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady now. The Alpha King gave a nod, his expression hardening once more as he turned back to the battlefield. "Stay with me, don't let your guard down. The rogues are vicious and they know no loyalty." Elisa's pulse quickened, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of her sword. She had trained for this, but nothing could have prepared her for the chaos that unfolded before her eyes. As they made their way to the front lines, Elisa could hear the sounds of battle growing louder. The clash of swords, the howls of wolves in the distance. It was a symphony of war, one she had never imagined herself a part of. The pack moved in unison, a coordinated force, but the rogues were relentless, striking with unpredictable speed. Elisa fought alongside the warriors, her sword flashing through the air as she parried and struck with precision. Her muscles burned, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Each time a rogue came at her, she remembered the promise she had made, to protect them all, to protect the pack. Through the chaos, Elisa could see the Alpha King fighting at the front. He was a force of nature, his movements fluid and precise as he tore through his enemies. But even he couldn't be everywhere at once. Elisa's heart raced as she spotted a rogue sneaking up behind him, a knife raised to strike. Without thinking, Elisa sprinted toward him, her sword raised. She was faster than she had ever been, her feet carrying her across the battlefield as though her life depended on it. And it did. With a roar, she collided with the rogue, knocking him off balance and sending him tumbling to the ground. She wasted no time, plunging her sword into his side, silencing the threat before it could reach the Alpha King. Rowan turned to her, his golden eyes wide with shock and something else, gratitude, perhaps. He didn't have time to speak, but the look he gave her spoke volumes. "Keep moving," Talon shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. Elisa nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she turned to face the next wave of rogues charging toward them. The battle raged on, and Elisa fought with everything she had. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was defending her family, her pack. The pack that had accepted her, that had trusted her. She could feel their strength, their unity, coursing through her veins. As the night wore on, the rogue forces began to waver. The pack had pushed them back, inch by bloody inch. Finally, the last of the invaders were either slain or driven off into the dark, vanishing into the night. Exhausted, bloodied, but victorious, Elisa stood among her comrades. The castle was safe, for now. But the question lingered in her mind. Who were these rogues, and what did they want? The answer to that question could mean the difference between survival and destruction for them all. Rowan approached her, his gaze intense. "You did well," he said, his voice rough from the battle. "But this is far from over. We have enemies we haven't even begun to understand." Elisa nodded, her heart still pounding. She had survived the first attack. But what lay ahead would require more than just strength. It would take every ounce of her courage, every ounce of her loyalty. The real war had only just begun. The aftermath of the rogue attack left the castle in a fragile state of quiet. The air was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The warriors, though victorious, were exhausted, their faces grim from the night's carnage. Elisa too felt the weight of the battle settling into her bones. Her arms ached from hours of combat, her body battered and bruised, but there was something else, a lingering unease that she couldn't shake. In the days that followed, the castle was quieter than usual. The Alpha King was focused on the aftermath of the attack, organizing his forces and making plans for the future. The warriors repaired the gates, and the healers tended to the wounded. But Elisa found herself unable to shake the sense that something much bigger was at play, something darker lurking just beyond the horizon. It was late one afternoon when she found herself once again in the castle's garden. The sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long shadows over the stone paths. The wind had calmed, leaving a stillness in the air that only heightened her sense of unease. She had come to the garden to clear her mind, to find some peace, but as she walked among the flowers, her thoughts kept circling back to the battle. What had the rogues wanted? Why had they come for the pack, for the castle? And more importantly, who had sent them? Elisa. The soft voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find Rowan standing a few steps behind her. He looked weary, his expression troubled, and she couldn't help but notice the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, as though the weight of the kingdom was pressing down on him. "Rowan," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Is everything all right?" He stepped closer, his eyes dark with concern. "I should be asking you that. You've fought well, but I can see the weight of it in your eyes." "The battle isn't over, Elisa, it's only just begun." She swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. "I know, but there's something else, something I can't shake. These rogues, they didn't just come here to raid the castle, they had a purpose. And I feel like we're only seeing a small part of the bigger picture." Rowan's gaze softened, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You're right. The attack wasn't random, but I don't know who's behind it yet. All I know is that there are enemies out there who want to see the pack torn apart, and they'll stop at nothing to do it." Elisa took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The night of the attack had been chaotic, the sounds of battle still ringing in her ears when she closed her eyes. But now, standing here with Rowan, she realized how much deeper this went than she had first thought. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about loyalty and trust, and the bond that was beginning to form between them. "You don't have to do this alone," Elisa said, her voice stronger now, filled with conviction. "I'll fight beside you. For the pack. For the future. We'll face whatever's coming together." Rowan looked at her, his golden eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe. Or something deeper. "I know you will," he said softly, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "You've proven yourself time and time again. I couldn't ask for a better ally." His touch lingered, and for a moment the noise of the world seemed to fade away. There was only Rowan and the quiet understanding that passed between them. Elisa's heart fluttered in her chest, but she quickly pushed the emotion aside. Now was not the time to let her feelings distract her. There was too much at stake. But Rowan's voice, gentle but filled with an underlying weight, cut through the silence. "I've come to realize something about you, Elisa. You're not just a warrior. You're becoming part of something much greater. You're becoming the heart of this pack." Her breath caught at his words, the heart of the pack. She had never imagined herself as anything more than an outsider, someone who had been sold and cast aside. But here, with Rowan, she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, she had a place in this world after all. Not just as a protector, but as someone who mattered. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of that," Elisa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'll try. For you. For the children. For all of us." Rowan's gaze softened and he took a step closer. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to trust yourself. And trust us." The air between them seemed to hum with the unspoken bond that had grown stronger in the days since the battle. Elisa realized that this wasn't just about the fight ahead. It was about what they were building together, something more than just survival, something deeper. As the evening sky darkened above them, Elisa felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. Whatever came next, she was no longer just an outsider. She was part of something much bigger, something worth fighting for, and she would fight. For the pack, for Rowan, for their future. The days after the rogue attack were filled with uneasy silence. The castle had returned to its usual routines, but there was a heaviness in the air, as if the very walls were waiting for something to happen. Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over, that there was more lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. The questions that had been plaguing her for days continued to gnaw at her. Why had the rogues attacked, and who had sent them? Elisa stood at the edge of the courtyard, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods. The forest that had once seemed peaceful and serene now felt like a dark, looming presence, its trees stretching like skeletal fingers toward the castle. The wind had picked up, swirling around her in unpredictable gusts. The faint scent of damp earth carried on the breeze, but there was something else, something unfamiliar and unsettling. Footsteps approached behind her, and Elisa turned to find Rowan standing a few feet away. His expression was tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a rare flicker of worry in his golden eyes. "Elisa," he said, his voice low but urgent, "we need to talk." She nodded, her heart quickening at the seriousness in his tone. Rowan had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke with that edge in his voice, it was impossible to ignore. She followed him silently as they moved to a more secluded part of the castle grounds, away from the watchful eyes of the warriors and servants. Once they were out of earshot, Rowan stopped and turned to face her. His eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice gravelly. "The rogues who attacked were not just random bandits. They were sent here by someone who knows the pack, someone who wants to see us destroyed." Elisa's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a chill creep down her spine. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rowan hesitated, his jaw tightening as if the words were difficult to say. "I don't know yet, but the leader of the rogues had a distinct mark, a symbol I've seen before. It's a symbol of a rival pack, one that's been growing in power in the north. They've been watching us for months, and now they've decided to make their move." Elisa's mind raced. A rival pack. She had heard rumors of packs fighting for dominance, but she had never imagined she would be thrust into something so dangerous, so political. "And what do they want with us?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. Rowan looked away, his gaze darkening. "They want control, the alpha position, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Elisa's stomach turned. The Alpha King was the heart of this pack, the leader who held everything together. If another pack wanted to challenge him, if they wanted to take the throne, everything she had come to know would be torn apart. "But why now?" Elisa asked. "Why the attack?" Rowan stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers once more, the weight of his words heavy between them. "Because they think we're vulnerable, because of the wariness within the pack, the recent tensions. They believe they can exploit that weakness, and if we don't act quickly, they'll bring even more forces against us." Elisa swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their situation sink in. The pack was her family now, the people she had sworn to protect. She had fought for them, bled for them. But this was different. This was a fight for the throne itself, for the very future of the pack. "We can't let them take control," Elisa said, her voice firm, a new sense of purpose rising within her. Rowan nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of a deeper, more personal struggle. "I know. That's why I need you, Elisa. I need you to help me prepare. We can't just wait for them to strike again. We need to be ready to fight back." Elisa felt her chest tighten at the weight of his words. "How?" she asked, her mind spinning with the enormity of what they were facing. "How do we stop them?" Rowan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, but the emotion in his eyes was undeniable. "We need to unite the pack, Elisa, all of them. The warriors, the healers, the allies we have in the surrounding territories. If we can strengthen our position, if we can show the rival pack that we won't back down, He paused, his gaze distant for a moment. "Then we stand a chance." Elisa nodded, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. She had fought for her place in this world, and now she would fight to protect it. "We'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "We'll unite the pack." Rowan's eyes softened slightly, and for a brief moment she saw the weight of his burden lift. "I knew you'd say that," he said quietly. "I trust you, Elisa. More than you know." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and meaningful. In that moment, Elisa understood the depth of her commitment to him, to the pack. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something much bigger, for loyalty, for unity, and perhaps for love. As they stood there, facing the uncertain future ahead, Elisa knew that the battle was far from over. The enemy was out there waiting for their moment to strike, but she would not let them take everything she had come to hold dear, not without a fight. The days following their conversation were filled with an increasing sense of urgency. The pack, still reeling from the attack, needed time to heal, but the threat of the rival pack loomed over them like a dark cloud. Elisa could feel it in every tense glance exchanged, in the hushed conversations behind closed doors, in the way the warriors moved with more purpose than ever before. There was no time to rest. Every moment was spent preparing for the inevitable. Elisa spent her days training alongside the warriors, strengthening her body and sharpening her mind. She had become faster, more confident with the sword, but she knew this fight would be different. The rival pack wouldn't just test her strength, they would test her loyalty, her resolve, and her ability to lead. And if she was going to prove herself, she couldn't afford to falter. One evening, after a long day of sparring, Elisa found herself standing alone in the courtyard, the fading light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the stone. Her body ached from the intensity of the training, but it was a welcome exhaustion. The silence of the night was broken only by the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." Elisa turned at the sound of Rowan's voice. He stood a few steps behind her, his posture relaxed, but his gaze steady. Despite the calmness in his appearance, Elisa could see the weight of the situation in the lines of his face, the way his shoulders were tense. He had become a different man since the attack. There was a hardness in him now, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine," Elisa replied, her voice steady, though she could feel the fatigue in her bones. "We need to be ready." Rowan stepped closer, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "I know you feel it. We all do. But if we don't take care of ourselves, we won't be able to fight when the time comes." Elisa met his gaze, her heart racing at the unspoken understanding between them. There was more at stake than just survival now. There was the future of the pack, the safety of the children, and the unyielding bond that was growing stronger between her and Rowan. "I can't afford to rest," Elisa said, her voice low but firm. "I need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Rowan stepped closer, his voice softer now, yet carrying the weight of a deeper concern. "You're already prepared, Elisa. You've proven that time and time again, but you need to trust that you're not alone in this. You don't have to carry the weight of it all." Elisa swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him, but the truth was, she didn't feel ready. The pressure was building, and with every passing day the fear of failure gnawed at her. She had promised to protect the pack, to stand by Rowan's side. But what if she couldn't live up to that promise? What if she wasn't enough? "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Elisa confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Rowan's expression softened, and he reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. His touch was warm, grounding. "You are strong enough, Elisa. Don't doubt that, you've already proven it. But you don't have to do this alone, we're in this together." For a moment Elisa closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the warmth of his presence wrap around her like a protective shield. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, with Rowan by her side, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "I don't want to lose you," Elisa whispered. her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to lose this." Rowan's thumb brushed softly against her cheek, and his voice, though steady, carried a depth of emotion. "You won't lose me. We'll fight together, and we'll protect each other. That's what matters." Elisa looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a fierce determination. For the first time, she truly believed what he was saying. She wasn't alone. She had the strength of the pack behind her, the unwavering support of the Alpha King, and the bond that had been forged through their shared trials. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate as Elisa stood there, her heart full of resolve. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for Rowan, for the pack, and for the future that they were building together. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. "I'm ready," Elisa said, her voice strong and steady. Rowan smiled, a rare, soft smile that reached his eyes. "I knew you would be." With that, they stood together in the fading light of the day, their hearts aligned, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The storm was coming, but they would weather it together.